it's very common for entire families to continue the tradition of farming a particular patch of land for many generations.
Imagine working on your farm like any other day, when suddenly,
far away from him, just off the side of the field, something glinting in the sun,
you stumble upon something that changes your life forever.
That's spinning at a high rate of speed.
That's exactly what happened to Edwin Four on September 1st, 1974, near the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border. What he saw beside that pond was so unbelievable that the world couldn't look away. Media swarmed, skeptics debated, and Four never wavered from his story. Was it a hoax? A government cover-up? Or did he witness something out of this world? Buckle up to hear what Edwin Four revealed, because this is one mystery that refuses to fade. In an interview, Edwin Four said that at around 7 a.m. on September 1st, 1974, Edwin Four set out to swath his canola field near the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border. His brother had called earlier, warning him to finish before the frost set in. It was just another day of farm work, nothing unusual, until he reached the east end of the field, near a slough. That's when he saw several dome-shaped objects sitting in the field. At first, he didn't think much of it. Someone had once told him that American hunters sometimes use structures like these as goose blinds, so he assumed that's what they were. But as he got closer, something felt off. The objects weren't just sitting there, they were moving. He stopped his tractor and stepped down for a better look. About 15 feet away, he noticed the grass underneath the objects was swirling, bending unnaturally. The strange part? The objects weren't even touching the ground. They were hovering about a foot in the air, spinning, one part rotating counterclockwise. In contrast, another section moved in the opposite direction. That's when a feeling of unease set in. Machines don't behave like that. Goose blinds don't float. Instinct told him to stop, to step back, and he listened. Standing in the open field, he realized he was looking at something he couldn't explain, and whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. As Edwin Four stood there, staring at the strange dome-shaped objects hovering over his field, his first thought was simple. Is someone playing a trick on me? It didn't seem real, but the longer he looked, the less it felt like a prank. There weren't just one or two of these things. 5. 3 large ones sat in the center, while 2 smaller ones flanked them, almost like they were guarding the bigger ones. They were positioned in a half-moon shape, just sitting there, spinning. The grass underneath swirled unnaturally, but the objects weren't touching the ground. That was the first eerie detail. Now here's the question that kept nagging at him. How did they get there without disturbing anything? They hadn't crushed the canola, left marks in the soil, or even touched the water of the nearby slough. It was as if they had just appeared. Getting closer, Four noticed more details. The larger ones were around 30 feet in diameter, with a distinct lip running around the edge, almost like a bumper. The metal had a strange quality, mostly shiny silver, like brushed aluminum or stainless steel, but with a dull gray section around the bottom. He'd seen metal before, plenty of times, and this looked like something that had been heated to extreme temperatures and then cooled. But why only the bottom? Why not the top? And then, as the objects continued to rotate, he saw rivets. Small bumps lined the surface, moving in a way that was only noticeable if you blinked at just the right moment, the way a spinning fan blade suddenly became clear for a split second. There was no mistaking it. These things were machines. Manufactured. Not some natural phenomenon. Not a trick of the light. He could see compartments, though their purpose was impossible to guess. And the more he looked, the more one thought sank in. This wasn't something that belonged in his field. It wasn't something that belonged anywhere on Earth. He blinked and noticed something else. Rivets. Small, round bumps lined the metallic surface, reflecting light as they spun. The top dome was chrome, gleaming under the morning sky, but the bottom lip was a dull gray, like metal scorched by intense heat. And then there were the pipes. 4 massive ones positioned around the bottom edge. Were they exhausts? Landing supports? Whatever they were, they seemed responsible for the strange impressions left on the earth. But here's what didn't make sense. How were they so close together? There was barely enough space between them to slip a hand through. Machines like this, positioned so precisely, moving with such coordination. How could that be accidental? Who or what was controlling them? Then came the fear. The kind that doesn't creep up on you but slams into you like a hammer. His body tensed. His heart pounded. 5 of them. 1 of him. If they moved toward him, that was it. He wasn't just scared. He was paralyzed. If someone had clapped their hands behind him so much, he might have collapsed in sheer terror. Instinct screamed at him to back up. Have you ever stood too close to a running machine, like the back end of a combine, and something in your gut told you to step away? As your body knows before your brain does something dangerous. That's what this felt like, only 100 times stronger. It was bitterly cold that morning. He had his parka on, gloves, and a cap with the ear flaps down. Still, he was shaking. But was it from the cold, or the sheer, unexplainable horror of what he was looking at? His teeth clenched so tight he could feel his jaw ache. Every part of him wanted an answer. What the hell is that thing? But deep down, he knew he wouldn't get one. And then it hit him. It wasn't just what he saw that unsettled him. It was what he didn't hear. No sound, no hum, no engine, nothing. Just silence, except for the distant noise of his swather running. But even that seemed to fade as if his mind was shutting everything else out. The world around him felt still, like time had momentarily frozen. Then another instinct kicked in, the most basic one of all. Run. Get out of there. Get back on the swather and put as much distance between himself and those machines as possible. So that's exactly what he did. Edwin backed away, step by careful step, never taking his eyes off the strange metallic object. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He reached his swather, climbed up the wheel side, and slid into the seat, hands trembling as he reached for the controls. And then, nothing. The engine, which had been running just fine when he stepped off, was now completely unresponsive. The key was in the ignition, turned over like normal, but the machine wouldn't move. Not a sputter, not a click, just dead. How was that possible? And that's when the fear set in. What if that thing started moving toward him? What could he do? Run? There was nowhere to go. Fight against that? His hands clenched the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was trapped, stuck in place with nothing but freezing air and an unnatural silence surrounding him. He had no idea how long he sat there. Half an hour? An hour? Time didn't feel real anymore. Then, just when he thought he might be stuck there forever, the machines began to rise, slowly, in steps. The 3 larger ones lifted first, the 2 smaller ones following close behind. They weren't shooting off into the sky, but moving with precision, control, and deliberation. And the worst part, they were closer now, directly overhead. He looked up, barely able to breathe. The entire underside of the machine was visible now. It wasn't just smooth metal. Openings, vents, and massive pipes were positioned at each corner. But what were they for? Exhaust? Propulsion? Something else entirely? More importantly, how had these things moved so silently from where they were to right above his head? Had the pipes shifted somehow, allowing them to glide sideways? Nothing about this made sense. Not the silence, movement, or sheer unnatural feeling of it all. Edwin sat frozen, staring up at those machines, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answers. From the side, it looked like only 4 openings were on the machine's underside, but from directly below, there were more. 6? 7? He couldn't be sure. The bottom was seamless and almost molded. No bolts, no visible panels, and nothing that suggested it was put together piece by piece. Just one smooth, unbroken surface with a large circular area in the center. Nothing is sticking out of it, and there is no obvious function. Just there. And that image, that part of the machine, that's what stuck with him the most. The part that still showed up in his nightmares. The swather still wouldn't start. No response, no power, nothing. And above him, those machines were just there, hovering in place like they had all the time in the world. Meanwhile, the crop below was completely flattened. Not burned, not broken. Just pressed down, like an invisible force had pinned it to the ground. On either side of him, the unflattened stalks still stood untouched. But where were those machines? It was as if something massive had been weighing down the air itself. And yet, there was still no sound. No roar of an engine. No mechanical hum. Just silence. The faint vapor trailing beneath them was the only sign that something was happening. It was not thick smoke, not a jet's contrail, just a thin, almost fog-like mist. It didn't billow or swirl. It just hung there, barely visible, like the air was disturbed, struggling to return to normal. And all he could do was sit there, trapped between the fear of moving and staying put. He just thought that was just air moving, or was that thing pumping something out? It was hard to tell at first, but then he saw vapor seeping from the ports, drifting downward as the machine rose. It wasn't thick like smoke, more like a haze. And the strangest part? He couldn't feel anything. No heat, no wind, nothing. He even held out his hands, half expecting something, a gust, a push, warmth, anything. But there was just nothing. And yet the crop below was completely flattened and bent to the ground under some invisible force. Then, the second those things disappeared, the stalks stood back up. Just like that. No slow recovery, no swaying, just down, then up. That didn't sit right. If there was pressure holding them down, why couldn't he feel it? What kind of force does that? The machines had no wings, no visible thrusters, nothing resembling an engine. And yet, the moment they decided to leave, they left. 1 second, they were hovering. The next, gone. Straight northeast, faster than anything he had ever seen. If you blinked, you missed them. No roaring engines, no sonic boom. Just a blur, and they were out of sight. And right then, as if nothing had happened, the swather finally roared to life. He didn't waste a second. I didn't even stop to think. I just gripped the wheel and gunned it straight home. By the time he got there, his mother was already annoyed. "What the devil took you so long?" Dinner was at noon. What was he supposed to say? That he'd just seen something impossible? That the world didn't work the way he thought it did? Could machines, or whatever they were, freeze time, bend crops, and vanish into thin air? So he just muttered something about watching something out in the field. And then his father, sitting at the far end of the room with his newspaper, looked up. What was it? He hesitated. He didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to see that look in their eyes. But he knew he had to say something. So he took a deep breath and told them. He told them what he saw as best as he could. Some object. Don't know where it came from. Don't know where it went. But it's not there anymore. Well, what happened to it? His dad asked. It took off. Where to? How the hell was he supposed to know? Straight up. That's all I know. His dad nodded as if something clicked. Flying saucers? Flying what? He had no clue what that even meant. Years ago, his dad had read about them in some German newspaper, stories about strange objects zipping around Canada and other countries. He went to check outside, But what was there to see? They were gone. Meanwhile, his mom was on the phone with his sister, planning to butcher an animal the next day. That's when she blurted out, something was wrong. Eden was home for lunch, but he didn't look good at all, she told his sister. He saw something. He won't say much, but it scared him half to death. His dad didn't buy it. Oh, come on. But his mom wasn't so sure. He wouldn't eat. He just sat there, pale as a ghost. He tried explaining and said there were 5 of them. He even showed me with his hands, round like flying saucers. The word was spreading. Soon, Ron Moyer, one of the locals, came by. He thought it might have been a helicopter landing in the slough. But from across the table, he hollered, "No, it wasn't a helicopter!" Nobody seemed to be listening. Later that day, Ron and his dad decided to go out and take a look. Maybe it was out of curiosity, or because they wanted to prove it was nothing. Meanwhile, he got back on the swather and drove straight to the same spot where it all happened. And there they were, his dad and Ron, crawling around in the slough, poking at the ground, staring at the flattened grass. He finally pulled up and asked, "What exactly are you guys looking for?" Ron shrugged. "You never know. They might have dropped something." Dropped what, exactly? A bolt? A screw? A pen? How would he even know they had one? One thing was certain. This wasn't just some joke. Whatever happened, it happened. The swather wouldn't start. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle. The things moved in ways nothing on Earth should be able to. People could believe whatever they wanted. But the facts? The facts were right there, clear as day. Scientists came later, poked around, and ran their tests. Their conclusion? They had no conclusion. They could only say that the grass had been pressed down in a way that lined up with a door opening on the side of an object. But beyond that, no answers. People kept asking him what he thought he was supposed to have some answer to. But why ask him? He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't an expert in anything except farming and swathers and weather. The only thing he was the guy who saw them. And that made all the difference. Later that night, he looked up and saw red, orange, yellow, and green lights shimmering in the northeastern sky. They weren't still. They darted back and forth, shifting in ways no normal aircraft would. He asked the officer beside him, "What do you think they are?" But how could anyone answer that? No one knew. His father, blunt as ever, finally said it. Unidentified flying objects. That's what they were. What else could you call something that didn't belong to any plane, helicopter, or machine we know? And then came the tests. A radiation expert from Winnipeg showed up with his Geiger counter. When he stepped onto the site, the needle jumped into the red. There were dangerously high levels of radiation. His machine rattled from the reading. People had been walking all over that spot. No one had thought about what they were stepping into. But maybe the strangest part? The machines had landed with eerie precision. A slough was just a few feet away, but they hadn't touched the water. A thick golden canola field was right beside the clearing, but they hadn't crushed a single stalk. How did they know? How could they tell the difference between water, land, and crops from way up in the sky? Yet somehow they had. And that's the kind of thing that keeps a person up at night. You close your eyes, and it's all still there. The machines, the lights, the strange energy in the air. People ask how he could keep thinking about it after all these years. How could he not? How do you forget something like that? And then, just when people were ready to brush it off as a wild tale, the same thing happened again. In 1989, they came back. But this time, they didn't land in a farmer's field. They hovered right over an elementary school. Children playing at recess looked up and saw them glowing, shifting, and moving in ways that defied logic. Their teacher saw them too. When they described what they had witnessed, their words matched what had been seen years before. Coincidence? Or proof that something out there is watching, waiting, and choosing where to show itself, on its terms? So tell me in the comments section what you do with a story like this. Dismiss it? Or let it sink in and wonder what if? Too many people saw it. The RCMP, radiation experts, the military, they were all there. And years later, those glowing objects returned, hovering over a playground full of kids. Maybe we'll never have answers. Maybe we're not supposed to. But whatever came down that day, it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last.